Welcome back to Old School Sports and our Out of the Park Baseball 24 playthrough of the Buffalo Wings. We are nearing the midway point of the 2034 season, and 70 games into the season, the Buffalo Wings are on pace for perhaps the greatest regular season in Major League Baseball history with a 54-16 record, 771 winning percentage. And we are already up 12 and a half games on the New York Mets, who have one of the best records in baseball other than us, and they're still 12 and a half behind. June and July have been absolutely incredible for this team. You can see we are in the midst of a 9-game winning streak right now. We lost 2 to the Mets about a week and a half ago. And then before those losses to the Mets, we had won 17 in a row, one loss before those, and then we had won 4 in a row. So just an insane stretch filled with victories for this Buffalo Wings team over the last month at this point. But obviously none of it's going to matter unless we can win a World Series. So the goal over the last 92 games of the season is to remain healthy, clinch home field advantage throughout the playoffs, and hopefully set ourselves up as well as possible to make that first elusive trip to the World Series with our expansion franchise and hopefully win the World Series while we're there. I want to hit on a couple things that have come up in the comment section to recent episodes, though, before we dig into the first-year player draft, which is today. Marcelo Meyer, who we traded away several years ago at this point, is in likely the final year of his contract. There is a team option for $33 million next year that I think will likely be declined by whichever team picks him up. But he has held up reasonably well. His batting profile is not all that different than when we've traded him. Defensive profile, not all that different. He is wrecked physically rather than fragile. But he's performed really well for Nashville. As a wrecked player, to have 123, 149, 135 games in the 3 seasons since we moved on from him, and he's pretty much an everyday player this year as well, is pretty impressive. That said, his performance has definitely taken a dip this year, hitting just 212 with 4 home runs and 212 at-bats, barely above replacement level. If we could get him for nothing, he would certainly be an interesting addition to our team that's trying to win it all, but not a guy that I feel that we need to chase after. I know that there's been some first guessing and second guessing of my decision to trade him away. I'm not really all that broken up about it. If we still had him on the books this year, we would not have been able to make the big acquisition of Jenneret, which has really provided the offense and the home run power that our team has missed through much of this playthrough. And I just don't think if he was on my team, I don't think he would have been this healthy as a wrecked player. I mean, those type of game totals, 3 consecutive seasons for a guy who's wrecked physically, is the type of thing that I have rarely, if ever, experienced with players, everyday players who are wrecked physically on my teams that I've been playing. So he's definitely done better than I expected when we traded him away, and he has absolutely played a lot more games than I expected he would when we traded him away. But we're not looking back, but I figured I'd give the update to those of you who are interested in what he has been up to. And viewers with a sharp eye also noted that we've reunited with Samuel Basallo, only he's not in the major leagues. He's in the Double-A Utica club for us this year. After we moved on from him in the 2032 season, he didn't even play in the majors last year did combine for 51 homers and 100 ribbies between high A ball and double A. And he's already blasted 24 home runs and 198 at-bats for double A Utica. Given his stark defensive limitations and the insane number of strikeouts that he generates, I think it's unlikely that we'll be using him in the majors at all this year, but do have a soft spot in our heart for the 3-time Silver Slugger winner, former Rookie of the Year, 2-time All-Star, and he even won a Wild Card Series MVP for us before his career really started going down the tubes his last year and a half with the Wings. But in the early stages of his career, he was a pretty productive hitter. 3 straight Silver Sluggers, as we talked about, 3 straight seasons with over 100 ribbies, despite the fact that he has always cooled the air with his swings and misses. And the last player that has been mentioned in the comment section that I wanted to check in on was Jorge Carrillo, our former international free agent signing as a pitcher back in 2025, almost a decade ago at this point. We had tried him as a starter 3 years ago at this point, or maybe it was two and a half years ago at this point, and it wasn't that successful. So last year he spent the entire year in the bullpen for us. This year he started in the bullpen for us, but with the injuries we've had to the pitching staff, gave him a second shot to see if he could be a starter, and he's been pretty good as a starter. 11-1 record with a 1.45 ERA and a 1.03 WHIP. That said, you look at his SIERA of 3.60, and it's basically the same as it was a year ago. His BABIP is only 244, which is, I believe, by far the lowest in his career. Actually, when he first came up as a rookie over 32 2/3 innings, he had a BABIP that low as well. And then it was real good as a reliever in 2031 also. But still 50 points less than his career level. So he's probably gotten lucky a bit. Looking at his pitching profile with a 5-pitch arsenal of average to a bit above average pitches, his stuff, his movement and control all look like they could be above average. He is durable. He's got enough stamina to start. He throws in the mid to high 90s. He's got ground ball tendencies. There's a lot of things we really like about him. Don't think he's an ace, but think that he's probably somewhere between the brilliant performance he's given us on the mound this year and the horrible performance he gave us on the mound as a starter 2 years ago. And if he can ultimately be a nice above average 3 or 4 starter for us, that wouldn't be a bad role for us to have him in for the next several years to come. So we'll find out more how he does over the course of the season. Certainly don't expect him to keep pitching at this pace, but real happy with the way that Carrillo has performed so far this year. So now we'll turn our attention to the first-year player draft, and pretty much all of the big-time prospects that we talked about briefly at the end of the last episode are gone. Jake Blymeister, starting pitching prospect, went number 1 overall out of UNC to the Minnesota Twins. Dave Shreve, a center fielder that I think we talked about, went 6th overall to the Cubs. Second baseman Marquez Polite went 8th overall to the Brewers. Starting pitcher prospect Ron Whitmer, another college player out of Loyola Marymount, went to the Yankees at number 17. Another starting pitcher, Tim Stowers, went to the Dodgers at 19. Dodgers actually picked a second starting pitcher, Tony Coram, at 20th overall. So the big names that we were most interested in and that some of you thought were the most impressive are gone at this point, given that we have the final pick in the first round after having the best regular season and record in baseball last year. So the top end of the opportunity set that we are looking at is not incredibly interesting to me. Three relievers are the highest rated pitchers available. I think they would all potentially be real interesting relievers. I just don't think I want to take any reliever in the first round unless I think it's the second coming of Mariano Rivera or Goose Gossage. But Andy Bivens certainly looks like he could have a high likelihood of being a very good major league pitcher. Jonathan Morrow with a major league quality fastball already at the age of 18 and a sinker that's not far off. Looks like he could do well as well. Julio Quintana, fastball already major league quality as well. Starting pitching, the highest rated prospect is Kevin Phillips. I'm actually mildly intrigued by him. Looks like he could potentially have a 4-pitch arsenal. Most likely will have a 3-pitch arsenal, but fortunately all 3 of those pitches are already not too far off major league quality. His stuff is never going to be exceptional, but his movement and control both look like they could be above average. I don't think he's an ace, but I think he is a nice, solid 4th or 5th starter in a best case scenario with his development. I think he could probably be a pretty respectable 3. So there's definitely some value in Kevin Phillips. There are also some less highly regarded starting pitchers available, and I tend to think some of them may fall to us in the second round. So if I had to go with a pitcher, it would certainly be Phillips, but I don't know that I'm going to go with a pitcher. You may be wondering about Nim Gabbard here, the starting pitcher. You see his stuff and his movement are both already above major league average. The issue, he's almost 22 years old, and it looks like his control is always going to be disastrous, and he's already fragile physically. So, yeah, if a guy like him is still around in the 3rd or 4th round, I'd certainly take a flyer on him, but I'm not going to use a first-round pick on him, even though he is a lot more advanced than most of the other guys that I've been talking about. And taking a look at the top hitting prospects, a lot of outfielders and corner infielders that are, again, according to our scout, the most highly regarded in terms of their potential. Joe Sanusi, the power jumps off the charts, and you love the durability, but he's going to hit home runs, and he's going to draw walks. He's going to strike out an insane amount of time and potentially really have a lot of problem just making contact with the ball. Not the type of guy that I'm going to go for. Joe Rogers, first baseman. I'd like to do better than this with a first-round pick. Doesn't bring anything to the table defensively. And in a best-case scenario, he's a bit above average major league bat, but a bit above average major league bat with nothing positive to say about him defensively is not all that exciting to me for a first-round pick. J.J. Foglia, another first baseman, could kind of say similar things about him. His contact stands out a bit more, but still, when this whole package is put together, it's not an exceptional offensive profile. A little better range. He's 6'4". He's a better defensive first baseman, but not all that exciting to me. Ben Elmquist, the center fielder, is a prospect that I am more intrigued by. Potentially really good outfield range, like the high work ethic, has some speed to hopefully take advantage of that gap power. A guy who could be a well above average contact and gap power hitter with average home run power and pretty good ability to avoid strikeouts is not a horrible prospect. Don't love the fact that he's not going to draw a ton of walks, and his home run power likely to be average at best, but not a bad combination of someone who could be a really good defensive left fielder, could play center or right if you needed him to, and potentially is pretty good at getting on base and generating some extra base hits with a little bit of home run pop is not the worst prospect in the world. Mike Clyburn, another center fielder, a somewhat similar profile. The gap power, not as great. He is durable, kind of much more balanced in terms of his ability on the base paths and his bunting ability. And he is better defensively. So I like both of these guys. Clyburn, coming out of NC State, I think we may have talked about him last time, is certainly further along and more developed, like the durability. As I said, I really like the glove. I don't love his bat as much as Elmquist's, and Elmquist also, obviously at 21 years old, a college player out of Lander University, so his competition level is not the same. But his bat is definitely more interesting, even though his glove is less interesting to me. Ben Bunker, a catcher, not a horrible batting profile for a catcher, but below average defensively, just not all that interesting to me. And then last but not least, there's Dan Repetto, 18-year-old third baseman, durable, not exceptional defensively, probably more of a first baseman when all is said and done, but a guy who could be above average in terms of his contact and home run power, and if he fully develops, well above average in both of those categories, which is clearly a pretty interesting combination. Another guy who's not going to walk a ton. So on the initial look, Repetto, Clyburn, and Elmquist are the three players that intrigue me the most. Our scouting director recommends we go with the third baseman, Repetto. I'm going to spend some time kind of searching through some other screens, looking at batting potential and pitching potential and guys who really stand out. You know, you can see on this list contact potential. Obviously, Clyburn and Elmquist are two of the top players available. Tylin Ho-Tailing, another guy who's got a really good contact and a pretty interesting potential batting profile. Like his work ethic, not the greatest outfield range, but could certainly play him in left or right. Like the fact that he's durable, so he's an interesting prospect as well. Searching on power potential, Sanusi, who we talked about, certainly stands out with that incredible home run power. I just think he's going to have problem making contact and not striking out, so he is not all that interesting to me. Repetto has a very well-balanced profile, kind of in a bunch of categories, which is probably why we think he's got the highest potential overall. Jared Brewer, we say he's only a 2.5-star potential prospect, but quite honestly, he's a college junior out of UC San Diego. He's further along than most of the other players that we've talked about. So it's pretty easy to see him being in the majors in a couple years. The question is just, is he ever anything more than a fourth corner outfielder? I think there's certainly potential. He could be a starting left fielder for a team for a few years if his bat fully develops, but doesn't bring much to the table on the base paths, doesn't bring much to the table fielding wise. He's basically a corner infield, corner outfield bat. And I don't know that I think the bat is so exceptional that I would chase him here. The gap power is his biggest trait, but he's also slow. So a lot of that gap power is going to be wasted with hits that could be doubles ending up as singles and hits that could be triples ending up as doubles, because he is a large lumbering oaf on the base paths. So I think the first thing I need to do when thinking about this draft is if I'm going to take a 21-year-old college center fielder, which 21-year-old college center fielder should I take? And looking at the batting potential of these two players, it's not really a fair fight. Clearly, Elmquist has higher potential. The only thing I'd say that Clyburn has going for him is that he is a left-handed hitter, so his splits may be a bit more favorable against right-handed pitching, which is who will likely be facing more often than not. But you look at where they are today, and they're basically exactly the same in terms of their current skills. And when we think about their potential going forward, Elmquist, much better gap power, better home run power, and better at avoiding strikeouts. And they're potentially the same in terms of their contact and their eye. So I think that clearly the basic batting ratings favor Elmquist. As we talked about before, Clyburn is certainly favored a bit with his bunting ability. Actually, not so much his bunting ability. It's more the stealing bases and the base running instincts where he stands out compared to Elmquist. But despite the fact that Clyburn is a bit more proficient, or significantly more proficient at potentially stealing and base running, his levels in these figures aren't so high that I think he's somebody that I'm going to be running with an incredible amount. So offensively, I still would prefer Elmquist over Clyburn. It's not all about offense, though. And defensively, it's kind of the opposite situation where Clyburn is clearly better than Elmquist in everything. Significantly better arm, better in terms of his error rating, and he's even got a bit better outfield range, an area that they're both pretty solid in. And we certainly think that Clyburn's proficiency at playing left, center, or right is potentially higher than Elmquist's is. And as much as what I like what Clyburn potentially brings to the table defensively, I think that Elmquist potentially has a better bat. I like the high work ethic with Elmquist. Now, to be fair, when we're talking about Clyburn, we have to acknowledge that he is durable in terms of his injury proneness. He's also faced a higher level competition at NC State. But if I'm going to go with one of these guys, I think I am going to go with the guy who I think has a potentially better bat, and that would be Ben Elmquist. So if I go with one of the college center fielders, it's going to be Elmquist. Now, the young outfielder Tylin Ho-Tailing is certainly interesting as well. I like his durability. I like his work ethic. I don't love the mediocre outfield range, but he's still a guy who you could certainly play in left or right. If his bat is fully developed, I think it's probably a little better than either of the other bats. But he's still a high school player who's almost 19 years old. I just think it's easier to project potentially what some of these college guys could become. Although, to be fair, Elmquist, his ability to draw walks, his ability to avoid strikeouts, and his ability to hit home runs for a 21-year-old is not exceptional. But the contact and the gap power already aren't far off major league quality. So I think as interesting a potential prospect as Ho-Tailing is, I would still lean towards Elmquist over him. Jared Brewer, another guy who's durable, almost 22 years old, basically has home run level or major league level home run power and eye and gap power at this point. Concern is that the gap power is kind of wasted with his low speed. Doesn't bring much to the table defensively. So I would still lean away from him. So if we think that Elmquist is the guy so far, probably should compare him to Dan Repetto, who our scout recommends and who our scout thinks is the highest potential everyday player out there. Is an 18-year-old compared to a 21-year-old. Repetto is not the player that Elmquist is today. But fully developed, he's a well above average contact hitter with well above average home run power, which is a pretty nice combination for a third baseman, particularly given that he should be, if he fully develops, about average everywhere else. So an interesting bat. Not as good a bunter. Okay on the base paths, but certainly not exciting. And then defensively, Elmquist, we've talked about, is a very good left fielder who could play center or right. Repetto is probably a first baseman who could play third base. I honestly don't have a real strong opinion between these two guys either. And given that I don't have a extremely strong opinion on any of the position players that we've talked about, that takes me back to the pitcher that we're most interested in, which would be Kevin Phillips. As I talked about, his fastball, his cutter, not far off major league level. His sinker should get there. I think his movement and control can both be well above average, and he's got enough stuff to get by. And if that changeup develops and all of a sudden he's got 3 60-plus pitches with a nice or a competent sinker as a fourth pitch, his stuff could end up being a bit higher than anticipated. Another guy that I'm intrigued by, but I don't really love, which isn't the best place to be when having to make a decision at the top of a draft. And while I don't think Kevin Phillips is going to be around in the second round, there is a chance that he will be because he's looking for $6 million. But there's a handful of other starting pitchers that I like only slightly less than Phillips, and I'm pretty confident that I'll get a chance at one of those starting pitchers and possibly even him himself in the second round. So I'm going to pivot back to a position player. And I don't think it's implausible that one of the position players that we've talked about could still be available in the second round. There's part of me that says to go with Repetto, who our scout thinks has far more potential than anyone else in this class. But I don't want to play that glove at third. Granted, the glove could get better, but... And the bat to me is just not exceptional enough that I want him. I mean, he'd be fine. If he fully develops and he's got 65 contact and 65 home run power, he would be fine at first base. He would do a nice job. But there's no guarantees he completely develops. So I think I'm going to go with the guy with better work ethic and the guy who's further along at 24 years old. I am concerned that the home run power, the eye, and the avoid strikeouts may develop not to the extent that we hope they do. Looking at the OSA ratings, they're a lot more concerned about his home run power, but I put a lot more stake in what our head scout thinks. I don't love any of these guys, but I think Elmquist is probably the most well-balanced prospect of them. So we're going to go against what our scout suggests, against what my heart suggests in terms of a starting pitcher. And we're going to draft Ben Elmquist here in this first round and then find out who's still available in the second for us. And somehow Dan Repetto is still available at the end of the second round. So that is certainly intriguing. Have to find out whether any of the starting pitchers that I thought might fall to the second round are still available. If not, it might be a pretty easy decision to go back to Repetto. And there are two of the starting pitching prospects that I thought might fall to us in the second round available. Gabe Wirtz, 18-year-old. Concern is whether or not that curveball develops, but certainly curveballs historically are less problematic than changeups. So he could be a three-pitch guy with plus stuff, plus movement and average control. Above average stamina, a bit above average in terms of holding runners on. So I think he's a decent starting pitching prospect for a second rounder. Tim Streets is the other guy that I'm interested in. Really like the work ethic. Don't love that he's horrible at holding runners on. Do like the fact that he has a potential 3 to 4 pitch arsenal and could ultimately have above average stuff, movement, and control with that high work ethic to boost his development. So I like both of these guys. I think there's a chance at this point that Streets, who's looking for $6 million, could fall into the third round. But given that there's still a guy in Repetto that we thought about for the first round, we don't love him as a prospect, but a guy that our scout is in love with, who's not looking for a ton of money, who's still available, you know, almost 70 picks into the draft at the end of the second round, is certainly pretty interesting to me. And our scout, since he recommended him in the first round, not shocking to see him recommending Repetto here in the second round. I think we take a flyer on Repetto and then maybe hope that one of the pitchers, one of the starters drops to us in the third round. And I certainly think it would be more likely that it would be Streets, given the amount of money that he's looking for. Landry, for the record, really concerned about whether that changeup develops. In Nim Gabbard, as we've talked about, really concerned about the lack of control. Either of those guys could be a guy that if we get to the 5th or 6th round and they're still on the board, would feel like we got real good value to bring on a player like that then. And perhaps even if they drop to the third round, if there's only one of these 3-star potential starters left, it may be hard for us to pass them by. But I think that Streets, with that demand he's looking for, is probably the most likely to fall. And fortunately for us, even though we don't have that type of money in what we've budgeted for the draft this year, with the excess money that we have in our budget, we could potentially bring him on board pretty easily and still potentially be able to make trades as we get closer to the trade deadline with some cash available. And if you've been waiting for me to say potentially, you're drinking a lot right now if you're playing the drinking game. So I think right now I don't overthink it and I go with the highest potential player on the board. And that is Mr. Repetto. Third round, still have Tylen Hotailing on the board. That would not be uninteresting to me if all the starting pitchers are gone. And honestly, it could still be interesting to me even if the starting pitchers weren't gone. But Tim Streets, the guy who's looking for the big money, is available. Kind of what we envisioned happening. I do like his work ethic. He looks like he could be a nice solid 3 or 4 starter if he fully develops. No guarantees that he fully develops. I don't love that runners who can get on base against him are going to feel pretty comfortable taking big leads off of him, but I don't think that's a reason not to draft a pitcher. And I feel like we've got the money to make this happen this year. The 2 players that we've drafted are under slot in the case of Elmquist and at slot in the case of Repetto with what they're looking for. So we've saved a little bit of money with the theoretically highest priced items that we should have. And I'm always intrigued about bringing a pitcher into our organization. So I think we're going to go with Tim Streets here in the 3rd. Moving on to the 4th. I don't know if there's any of those relievers. Yeah, none of the top relievers are left at this point. Take a look at the top batters available, and Tylin Ho-tailing is still out there. He's not looking for a crazy amount of money. In the 4th round, I think that's really good value for a guy who I didn't think was all that less a prospect than the guys that we ended up picking in the 1st and 2nd round. So I like the way that this draft is broken for us so far. Not going to spend a ton of time thinking about it. Going to count on the scouting that I've done over the last couple days in real time. And we are going to draft Ho-tailing here in the 4th round. And now we'll spend a little more time offline digging into perhaps where we should go in the 5th round. And I just noticed, if you've been paying attention, we're actually in the 6th round right now. I think I may have misstated some of those most recent picks as to which rounds they were because of draft picks that we lost. Or maybe the last one was the 4th round, and now we just skipped over the 5th round to the 6th. Not 100% sure. Be able to see when I watch this video, but we are in the 6th round now, not the 5th. And looking back here at the board, we actually skipped our 3rd round pick, which makes sense because that is what we had to give up when we signed Jenna Rett. So the fact that Streets and Ho-tailing were still around in the 4th and 5th rounds, to me, is potentially great victory, and I think some good fortune for the Buffalo Wings. And I guess we shouldn't be surprised by that, because with a 54-16 record, everything that can possibly go well for the Buffalo Wings has been happening in this 2034 season so far. And we didn't really do anything all that exciting in the final 15 rounds of the draft, but feel like the players that we brought on with our 1st, 2nd, and 4th and 5th round picks were pretty interesting. They were 3 position players that we were talking about, and at least thinking about at a very high level for the 1st round, and we got them in the 1st, 2nd, and the 5th. And then I think we got pretty good value with the starting pitcher in the 4th round as well, because we had some excess money to spend, and he was looking for a little more. You can see even with the money that we've offered to him, we've got over $4.5 million to potentially bring on some salary and trade as we get closer to the trade deadline over the next 6 weeks or so of game time. With a 54-16 record, we clearly don't have any major holes to fill, but certainly injuries and other things can happen, and it's good to have a little bit of flexibility that potentially we can use to fill any holes in this roster that do develop, since we are all in on this 2034 season. And the good news is that we won our first 3 games after the draft to extend our winning streak to 12 before finally losing our 3rd game of the month of June here on June 25th to the Rangers. We've got the A's and the Nationals on the road for 5 games before the end of the month. But clearly it's a very successful month for us here in Buffalo. Record stands at 57-17 with less than a week left. And another little good piece of news, Harleen Susanna, who's been on the IL ever since the first game of the year, and he is not a monster pitcher. I've been looking at our minor leagues, so that's compared to A-ball, but still think he is a very good and useful major league pitcher for us. Since he's almost 31 years old and he's been out since April, we're going to probably give him a couple of starts in the minors just to hopefully shake the rust off a bit in AAA Albany, but will be nice to hopefully have him back in the rotation before the All-Star game. And just as Harleen Susanna is getting ready to start his rehab assignment, we've lost our starting center fielder, the rookie Tyreek Hardage, out with back tightness, expected to be 2 to 3 weeks. He had a monster game for us on opening day, has slowed down a bit since then, but still certainly holding his own as a major leaguer, especially given that he only had an abbreviated stint in Albany last year because of injuries. And quite honestly, he had only played 93 games in A-ball or higher before he was promoted. So he's hitting 249, 11 doubles, 3 triples, 8 homers, and 277 at-bats. A bit below average overall as an offensive player. Does have 9 stolen bases. Solid defense with that really good outfield range, though. So he's been an above replacement level player. Looks like our scout thinks he can still get a little better in terms of his contact, his gap power, and his batting eye. Normally, I almost wouldn't mind because we've got a lot of talent that can also play center field that is on the verge of being ready for the major leagues in AAA. Unfortunately, both of those players are hurt right now. Dave Zapf, who was our 5th overall pick in 2028 in that great 2028 draft for us, is the number 99 prospect in baseball. He's out for 3 weeks with a fractured foot now. He would be a guy to clearly potentially consider bringing up with that injury to Hardage, but we can't. But he's hitting 307 with 20 doubles and 15 homers in half a season in AAA Albany. So he is pushing to be on the major league roster and hopefully will be there soon. And the other guy to consider is Tim Gaglia, who is perhaps the most talented defensively with that exceptional range of all of our young center fielders. He's been also having a big year in Albany, hitting 316, 16 doubles, 6 triples, 9 homers, 127 WRC plus. He's out with hamstring tendonitis for 3 days, but I think he will ultimately get the call 3 days from now when he is healthy to hopefully take over as our starting center fielder for a couple weeks, give him the opportunity to get some major league experience and hopefully get Hardage healed up. And we made it to July 1st. We struggled horribly over that final week of the month of June with a pathetic 500 record. But when all was said and done, we have had 2 absolutely incredible months in a row. 2 straight months with winning percentages over 800, 23-5 in May, and now 21-5 in June. Not surprisingly, our glittering 60-19 record is 4 games above Pythagorean expectations. Can't really expect a team to keep playing at this pace or to ever play at this pace, but if we're able to get through this season with over a 700 winning percentage, that would still be a pretty impressive accomplishment. We rank 2nd in the National League in runs scored. You can see we're basically the top 3 in almost every batting category, with the exception of home runs, where we are now in the middle of the pack with the addition of Jenneret. Walks, we rank 4th. Steals, we're 1st. Base running, we're middle of the pack. And we are 1st in the National League in runs allowed. And you can see we are 1st in many categories. top 5 in every pitching category except for strikeouts, and we are one of the top handful of teams in terms of defensive efficiency and zone rating. So everything, as we are 2 games away from the midway point of the season, that could be going well for the Buffalo Wings thus far in 2034 is going well for the Buffalo Wings. And we've reached the midway point of the season with a 61-20 record. So if things continue at this pace, we're going to go 122-40. I don't expect that will happen, but clearly it's been an incredible season. We've also been selling out just about every game. Not a shock given how well we're playing. So we're going to just bump ticket prices up $1 to $34 and see if we can continue selling out and perhaps generate a bit more revenue than we have been thus far. And as we approach the All-Star break, or actually we've now gotten to the All-Star break, we've hit our first rough patch of the season, a 4-5 record for our Buffalo Wings here in the month of July. That has dropped our winning percentage to a sickly 727. We've got 3 weeks left until the end of the month and the trade deadline, so we're going to probably spend a fair amount of time in our next episode digging into the potential trade market and where we may be able to find a little bit of help for our team. But the important thing that's going to let us know where we might need to look for help is to do a review of what our team looks like 88 games into the season, who's performing well, who's underperforming, and where we might have some holes to fill. And right after we see how many All-Stars our Buffalo Wings have in this 2034 season, with by far the best record in baseball and a 13.5 game lead over the Mets in the National League East, we will take a look at our All-Stars, and then we'll take a deep dive into how everyone's performing. Just past the midway point, last year's Rookie of the Year, Mike Heiner, hitting .330, third in the National League. New addition, Shamar Jenneret, batting .311 with 23 homers, which is third in the league, and 70 runs batted in, which is the best in the league. We know he's going to be an all-star because we got a little pop-up shortly ago that he was the #1 vote getter in all of baseball for the all-star game. Deshaun Seifu with 44 steals. Looks like he is set to lead the National League in steals once again. Heiner is tied for second in batter WAR at 3.6. Jorge Carrillo, second in the National League with a 2.15 ERA. Carrillo leading the league with 12 wins. His teammate Sincere Shazier second with 11 wins. We checked in on the overall team stats not all that long ago, so I don't think there's going to be any huge changes. We're still 4 games above Pythagorean expectations, still second in the National League in runs scored, and we are still first in the National League in runs allowed here at the All-Star break. And taking a look at those All-Stars and the fact that we were just talking about the fact that Jorge Carrillo and Sincere Shazier were 1-2 in the league in wins, no of our starting pitchers from the best pitching staff in baseball were named All-Stars this year. Bryce Miller, our closer, named an All-Star for the first time. He is having a magical season. 1.31 ERA over 34 1/3 innings pitched. 22 saves in the 32 games that he's pitched with a 3-1 record. Speaking of magical seasons, the guy who is knocking on the door to take away the closer role from Bryce Miller, our new addition, Lorne Walborn, has been getting a ton of action as our stopper. He's pitched 82 and 2/3 innings over 45 games, a 6-1 record, 5 saves, 18 holds, a 1.85 ERA, holding opponents to below a 200 batting average and well over a strikeout per inning. His 2.7 WAR dwarfs what we have gotten from Miller, and Walburn joins him this year as a first-time All-Star. So 2 members of our pitching staff are All-Stars. Mike Heiner, who we just talked about, last year's National League Rookie of the Year, now named an All-Star for a second consecutive season. He's hitting .330 with 14 homers, 52 ribbies, 3.6 WAR, as we mentioned, tied for second in the league. And then Shamar Jenneret, the new addition, the cornerstone of this enhanced offense, 311, 23 homers, 70 ribbies, as he tries to see if he can be a back-to-back MVP in 2 different leagues, for those 2 seasons. You know what I mean. So not only 4 All-Stars. I missed Bobby Bolig. I'm sure some of you are saying, what are you, blind, old school? And I am getting old, but I am not blind. But Bobby Bolig named an All-Star for the first time, so that's nice to see. 3 first-time All-Stars out of the 5. Bolig, of course, we picked up in that big trade with Pittsburgh before last season, having an even better year for us this year than his previous year, hitting .296, 19 homers, and 57 ribbies, that 143 WRC+. He is an absolute force against right-handed pitching, and we try not to play him against left-handed pitching if at all possible, because he's not that good at hitting lefties. So 5 total All-Stars, Jenneret, Bolig, and Heiner among the position players, Walburn and Bryce Miller among the relievers and pitchers more generally. And turning to the stats of everyone on the team, I think we do have some complaints for guys who aren't All-Stars. Sincere Shazier taken over as our number 1 starter this year after going 10-3 with a 2.38 ERA as a rookie. Midway through the season, he's 11-3 with a 3.55 ERA. His BABIP has gone up over 50 points this year. His Sierra up more than half a run. That said, he's still on pace for about a 4.5 WAR season, so a really nice year by the 24-year-old sophomore in the major leagues, Sincere Shazier. Juan Estrada has missed some time on the IL, but good to have him back after he missed the last 4 months of last year. 7-2 record, 2.50 ERA. His stamina, which has been volatile, seems to have settled in at a more than acceptable level for a starter, striking out more than a batter per inning. Don't think that he's ever going to be an ace, but he is certainly a very useful player for us, particularly when we factor in that he's a two-way player. Not hitting as well this season as we would hope. 269 average, and his on-base percentage is just 333, which is down almost 100 points from a year ago. Still has been an above-average offensive player and has hit the first home run of his career, and he has a ridiculous 20 doubles in 156 at-bats. So he is definitely making the most of his incredible gap power and his excellent running speed to generate a lot of extra base hits for us. The biggest snub, though, for the All-Star team among our pitchers, I think, has to be Jorge Carrillo, leading the league with a 12-2 record, a 2.15 ERA, which was second in the league. I just don't know how you leave a guy like this off the All-Star team. I guess it was probably a numbers game, and I'm imagining that some of those other teams that have starters who were named to the All-Star team, they're probably the only player on their team who was named. But I don't know what else Carrillo could be doing to earn an All-Star appearance if you're, as I said, leading the league in wins and second in ERA at the All-Star break. It's going to be pretty rare that you're not named an All-Star. but that did happen to Korea this year. Drake Purvis, who we picked up in the trade for Chris Sabatka, that I know some of you are disgusted with us about, has been pretty mediocre for us. A 6-5 record with a 4.98 ERA. Now, the thing that we can say about Purvis compared to Shazier, who has, or not Shazier, compared to Harleen Susanna, who's just made his third rehab start in Albany and will be bringing up after the break, so we're going to have to make a move to get him on the roster. But the thing we can say about Purvis compared to Susanna and Sobotka, as it has been out there taking the ball for either us or Nashville every fifth day, and there certainly is a value in that. But clearly would hope with giving up Sobotka and giving up a decent pitching prospect, a proven major league pitcher in Max Meyer, and then some other pieces for him. We paid a pretty high price and certainly would be hoping for more than below average advanced metrics from a starting pitcher like Drake Purvis. While we're talking about Sobotka, let's check in on him and see what he looks like. And he is still out for another 2 weeks with shoulder inflammation. It does look like we think his control is moving back up. His stuff and his movement not where they used to be, and his splitter is his third pitch. Still looks borderline at this point of his career. Will be interesting to see what he looks like when he gets back from that shoulder injury. Going to be gone, looks like, for another couple weeks. Then presumably Nashville will put him on a rehab assignment. But we will make sure to scout him and follow up on how he is doing in future episodes, so you can either mock me or sing hosannas towards me for my wisdom in letting him go. I'm guessing none of you will be doing the second part of that, even if Sobotka is wrecked physically coming off of this, which I'm not expecting. You'll see that our attendance dropped pretty sharply when we had raised it up to $34, just that little bit, so we did tweak it back to $33.50, trying to just kind of dial things in here at this point to get a lot of fans in the seats, but more importantly, try to maximize our revenue per game. And last but not least, among the pitchers, there's Andrew Painter, who has been excellent for us this year between starting role and some work in the bullpen. 6-2 with a save, a 1.71 ERA over 84 and a third innings pitched. 2.15 BABIP, so he certainly seems like he has probably gotten pretty lucky. Don't expect him to continue pitching that well. Would think that most likely when we bring Susanna back up, we will move Painter into the pen, and where he's been exceptional for us in the past. The last time he was an all-star was in 2032, when we had him with an incredible workload, 93 games, 143 and a third innings pitched is our stopper. So think that with the way Walborn is pitching, it's more likely that Painter will be in a setup role for us, but looking forward to seeing what he can do out of the bullpen. And he's certainly pitched well enough this year that if we have some injuries and we need him back in the rotation, we'll feel good about that. We've already talked about the big two out of the bullpen in Miller and Walborn. Yohane Varejo, the second-year player, just came back off the IL. So he's only pitched 17 and a third innings this season, but with a 2.60 ERA and 22 strikeouts. So good to have him back. Hayden Yinger, another guy who could start for us, having a really nice season out of the pen. 6-2 record, 1 save, 7 holds. Crazy 57 strikeouts and 39 and 2/3 innings. ERA below 3 and a Sierra of 1.36. So Yinger seems to be excelling in a setup role. You know, Miller, Walborn, Varejo, and Yinger really like those top four arms that we have out of the bullpen, and think that when we slide Painter in there, there's going to be 5 arms in the bullpen that we've got a ton of confidence with. The middle and long relievers have been shakier, without a doubt. Matthew Wenzel, the left-handed pitcher, 1-1 record, does strike out more than a batter an inning, but a mid-4s ERA. a little below average in his ERA plus, a little above average in his FIP minus. Franklin Heel could be nearing the end of his time with us. I think we do have him signed for another year certainly, and then a team option. I know he is a guy that has been pretty volatile for us in the past, particularly in the playoffs. Having a rough year this year. The one thing I will say in his defense, though, is that his Sierra is almost 2 runs better than his actual ERA, and the BABIP he's allowed is 4.67. So certainly seems like he has probably gotten a bit unlucky thus far. Hopefully that will mean better things from him in the second half of the season. Isidro Ochoa was brutal as a starter for us. He's been somewhat better out of the pen on the year, a 3-2 record with a 4.67 ERA. Taking a look at his pitching splits, and as a starter, 5.05 ERA. We yanked him from the rotation. As I talked about, been better as a reliever with a 3.66 ERA, but clearly not nearly as many innings pitched in that role. And then the final original Buffalo Wing, Sean Sullivan, continues to hang on to a roster spot. We've got team options at relatively high numbers for what he is the next 2 seasons, so it's not inconceivable that this could be Sullivan's last year with us. Not inconceivable that if we make a trade to bolster our starting rotation or bullpen, he would be a guy whose roster spot could certainly be in jeopardy, and we wouldn't mind if we could include him in a trade if we do decide to do something with the pitching staff. Still striking out more than a batter per inning, and another guy whose Sierra is 2 runs better than his actual ERA. That 3.40 BABIP should get better. Look at his profile, and he's a perfectly acceptable guy to have as part of a major league pitching staff. That said, that $3.8 million number for a guy who's the 10th or 11th, or probably worse than that, probably realistically the 12th or 13th pitcher on our pitching staff, is a reasonably high number. And as I mentioned, he's the last player who was left with the Buffalo Wings who was on our major league roster day one of our first year in the majors in 2026. And his days in Buffalo could be getting close to an end. So after talking about that pitching staff that's looking to be the best in the National League once again, we'll turn to our offense, which is right now second in runs in National League this year, which is right where they were last season as well. The catching platoon has been a bit disappointing, to be honest. Andres Medina, love his defensive ability. The bat obviously has its holes, most notably the massive amount of times he's going to strike out. And he has struck out 29 times in just 81 at-bats, so striking out well over a third of the time that he is up. Hitting just 198 with 3 homers in those 81 at-bats. He is a well below average offensive player. Replacement level, when we factor in his excellent defense, he could conceivably be in the mix to be our starting catcher next year when we move on from Rutschman. So would certainly love to see some of that development that we think can still happen with him actually happen over this last half of the season. Clearly, if his batting average remains on the interstate, it's going to be hard for us to feel real good about going into next season with him as our presumptive starter. Would not feel bad about having him back as a backup given his great defense. But definitely would like to see a little more from his bat. Speaking of seeing a little more from his bat, Rutschman, as we talked about, likely, almost certainly in his final year with us. Hard to see us exercising that $41.5 million team option for next year. His ratings have started to drop dramatically this year. He still has a good eye to draw some walks, but he's below average in all the rest of the offensive categories, and he's trending towards being average in terms of his catcher ability. So he struggled offensively this year, hitting .248 with 4 home runs, below average offensively, just a win above replacement. I think, we kind of have timed that contract as well as we could. We had to give him 7 years to get the deal done. Fortunately, we have the team option for that seventh year. And his first 4 years with us, or his first 5 years with us, he made 3 All-Star teams, had a WAR above 4 in the first 4 of those seasons, was still 3.6 last year. He's still on pace to have a 2 WAR this season. I mean, he hasn't completely fallen off the face of the earth, but he's certainly not a $37.5 million player anymore. So our hope is maybe he gets a little bit more productive over the second half of the year. But the real hope is that in this, what will almost undoubtedly be his final season with us. Clearly, we're not going to exercise the $41.5 million contract. Depending on what the market looks like and depending upon what he's looking for, could we have him back as a potential starter or backup next year? It's feasible. I'd probably feel better if he were a backup than a starter at this point in his career, given that I don't necessarily feel great about Funky Cole Medina as a starter either, though. Could be a situation where we decide to keep Medina as the backup, let Rutschman go even if he's not looking for crazy money, and then try to find our starter for next season somewhere else. But we'll deal with those issues going forward. Rutschman, I believe, is still not willing to waive his no-trade clause. So looking at our catchers, you could argue that that's an area where maybe we would want to be active as we get closer to the trade deadline and maybe try to get ahead of finding next year's starter now, given that that's not the most productive position in our lineup. But I think we're probably pot committed to Mr. Rutschman for these last couple months of his Buffalo career, given that he's got the no-trade clause. Mike Heiner, we already talked about, has worked out really well for a 32nd pick in the draft. Came up after just a couple of months in the majors. We signed him to an extension last year before he had ever played a major league game. And all he's done since then is win a Rookie of the Year and be named to 2 All-Star teams. He's got a 150 WRC plus this year. Certainly probably in the mix with his teammate Shamar Jenneret to be receiving some MVP votes when this season is over. Deshaun Seifu is probably the most conspicuous all-star snub of our everyday players. The second baseman has somewhat surprisingly only been named to 2 all-star teams. He has a Silver Slugger, has a couple of Gold Gloves, and he was a Divisional Series MVP for us 3 years ago. Having another vintage Deshaun Seifu season, hitting over 300, 28 doubles, 10 triples, 44 stolen bases, going to be close to 100 runs again, probably will be close to 50, if not over 50 doubles again, having a monster season in terms of triples so far, 118 WRC plus, 3.2 WAR. He's worked out really well for a number 1 overall pick. We talked earlier about the fact that he's on pace to lead the league in steals for the 7th time in his career. Certainly with those 10 triples, looks like he could potentially lead the league in triples for the 4th time in his career. Could end up leading the league in doubles, and he's always in the mix to lead the league in at-bats, runs, and hits as well. So he is having a really unique career. I think he has an excellent chance of finishing up as the number 2 base stealer in baseball history behind only Rickey Henderson. I think he's got a pretty good shot at getting to 1,000. Wish he, was a little more respected by the voters for the awards and the fans, but I can't say that I am disappointed with what Seifu's done over the course of his career, but he doesn't hit home runs, and we know that not only do chicks dig the long ball, but apparently award voters in the major leagues dig the long ball as well. And continuing to move across the diamond to third base, Cam Collier having a pretty solid season for us. One of the better years he's had for us, hitting 278, 10 homers and 227 at-bats, 123 WRC plus. I think that playing him primarily against right-handed pitching has probably helped enhance those numbers relative to the league somewhat compared to previous seasons when he was also playing against left-handed pitching. Joe Edwards, the youngster, is only regularly starting against left-handed pitching. That said, because of injuries and because he's one of the most versatile utility players on our team, we've still gotten him 59 starts and 72 games overall, even though he's only actually scheduled to start when we're playing left-handed pitchers. The batting average only 239, but does have 10 homers and 201 at-bats. He's drawn 36 walks, so the on-base percentage is 370. Not as productive as he was last year when we called him up midway through the season, but still a very useful player for us to have, given his powerful bat, his ability to draw walks, and his ability to play close to competent defense at a number of positions. Alejandro Mercado is our utility guy, Rule 5 draft pick. I think, yeah, we are past the number of days where we have to keep him on the roster at this point. So we'll have to think about whether we want to make another roster move. With that good range, he is basically our backup shortstop, our backup second baseman. You can see he's only started 10 games, but for a guy who at 22 years old, we were forced to bring from rookie ball to Major League Baseball to keep his rights. He's performed pretty well, hitting 245 in those 53 at-bats. He's been a replacement-level player, but given that he's a 22-year-old who probably should really be in single-A ball, happy with how he's performed. As we talked about when we picked him up and decided to keep him on the team. Really intrigued by his really good infield range, like his durability, and the fact that his bat looks like it could be a average-ish type major league bat. A player with that infield range who, when we do end up sending him down to the minors and getting him also adept at playing second base, seems like he's got some potential value for us as a utility infielder who's not an automatic out and is respectable defensively for the next few years. So hopefully having Mercado on the team will work out. Our starting shortstop, Tim Hull, the batting average continues to move in the wrong direction, down to 234 this year, has been well below average offensively, and that's meant that even with his respectable defensive ability, he's barely been above replacement level in terms of his WAR. Looking at his batting profile, I would think he probably does better over the second half of the year. Not a perfect answer at shortstop, but he's what we've got at this point. Clearly, when I think about the infield, first base, second base, there's nothing to do. If there was a player out there who could potentially mix and match with Collier, Edwards, and Hull at second base and short, and we could then send Mercado down to AAA, it's certainly a luxury to be potentially looking for a player like that with the team that we have, but that would be one potential path for us to consider in the trade market over the next few weeks. Turning to our outfielders, and as I mentioned earlier, our starting center fielder, the rookie Tyreek Hardage, is on the IL, so we've already kind of seen what his stats were when he went on the IL, having a respectable season for us. Start off with the two All-Stars, Bobby Bolig, 296 average, 19 homers, 57 ribbies, 143 WRC plus, 3.2 WAR on the season. I'm assuming his splits between right and left-handers are just going to be absolutely ridiculous. Actually, they're not. That's surprising. He's very effective against right-handers, 295 average, 145 WRC plus. but he is 8 for 26 against left-handed pitching. He's somehow hitting 308 against left-handed pitching this year. That said, only 2 extra base hits, only 1 driven in, and only 1 walk as well, while striking out 7 times in those 26 at-bats. So he's still been a bit below average overall in terms of his performance against left-handed pitching. But when you look at his ratings and the pretty dramatic splits between right-handers and left-handers, the fact that he's that close is a bit surprising to me, but happy to have Bolig as a first-time All-Star. Jenneret, we signed to that monster $280 million 7-year contract, front-loaded with $50 million this season. Felt like we needed a power bat for the middle of our lineup. That is one thing that we have consistently been lacking over the course of this playthrough. And Jenneret, as the #1 All-Star getter in the National League, vote getter, All-Star for the 4th time, coming off of his MVP season in the AL, is poised for another monster year. .311 batting average, 23 homers, 70 ribbies. Certainly in the mix to lead the league in homers or ribbies again. Probably needs to significantly improve that batting average to potentially compete for a batting title or a triple crown, but with a 148 WRC plus and a 2.6 WAR, Jenneret has been a nice guy to build the offense around. Nate Kimmel is a guy that we brought up this year. He had nothing left to prove in Albany after hitting .307 last year with double-digit doubles, triples, and home runs. He's only regularly starting against left-handed pitching for us because our team is just so loaded. And he's been productive, .281 average, 8 doubles, and 3 home runs in just 96 at-bats. Would obviously prefer to be getting more consistent playing time for him. Hopefully extract that last little bit of development out of him that we think is available. But we are a team that's chasing history right now, and we're not going to start somebody just to start them. But Kimmel certainly potentially has a role on this team for many years to come. Quite honestly, though, when we think about Heiner and Bolig and Jenneret and Hardage, Kimmel's also a potentially valuable trade chip, particularly with guys like Tim Gaglia coming up behind him. Gaglia has been up now for 10 games because of the injury to Hardage, hitting .250, 2 doubles, and a triple for us thus far. A little below average defensively, a little above replacement level overall, likely driven by his excellent range in the outfield. And last but not least is Gavin Grahovac, another one of these guys who's primarily starting against left-handed pitching, involved in a platoon situation, hitting .264 with 3 homers and 19 ribbies and 87 at-bats, 107 WRC plus, only a replacement level player for us. He's not exceptional defensively, although he can play a lot of different positions. He's fragile. He is a guy who is not in our long-term plans. We do have him next year with the Brewers retaining a big chunk of his contract. That's the only thing that makes it palatable to have him on the team. But honestly, if we were looking to make a trade, given that the team that he would be going to would only be responsible for 20% of his contract, if there was some value in a guy like Grahovac, given that we've got guys like Kimmel and Gaglia and Tyreek Hardage, who, as we talked about, is on the IL, and Dave Zapp, another young outfielder, also on the IL, we certainly could look to move on from someone like Grahovac if there was some value for him in a trade as well. So I don't think there's any obvious holes that we need to fill, but that said, we are clearly all in on winning this year. We're halfway to our goal of having the best record in baseball and home field advantage for as long as we're around. And if there's a trade that we can make that's going to increase our chances of winning, I'm absolutely going to do it over the next 3 weeks. Catcher, another good infielder to me, are the two areas where maybe we could look to make some moves. I think catcher would be tough unless we wanted to trade away Medina, since Rutschman, I think, is very unlikely to all of a sudden drop that no trade clause when he's playing for a team that looks like it could definitely win a World Series this year. If we could bring on a monster catcher who's in the last year of his contract, who's better than Rutschman or Medina at this point, I think we'd probably have to consider using Medina in that trade, even if it meant that we'd be heading into next season with no major league catchers potentially, because Medina, who is signed for next year, would be with another organization. Rutschman, we're not going to exercise his option, and presumably the only type of monster catcher we'd be able to bring on board for a reasonable amount would be someone who's in the final couple months of their contract. So we'd potentially be leaving ourselves open at catcher next year if we make that type of trade. And I don't even know if there's an option to make that type of trade. Clearly, we can trade for players who aren't on the trade block. But right now, when we think about catchers, doesn't necessarily look like there's a huge difference maker. Tim Theriot, Tim the Riot. Not really what we're looking for defensively, although at this point I think he is clearly a better bat than either of the guys that we have. And Jose Herrera, nice defensively, but not the best personality to be bringing into that clubhouse, and not much of a bat either. So I don't think there are any answers there. Infielders I mentioned. If Kenya Huggins could play positions other than first base in the infield, and he could play any positions competently in the infield, that would be kind of the bat that would be interesting for us to add for potentially not a huge price. Meyer, not shockingly, partially torn labrum, out 3 to 4 months, so feel a bit vindicated by that. Because it looks like Marcelo Meyer's season is over, and he's only going to play 65 games for Nashville this year, hitting .220 basically as a replacement level player. Presumably they will not exercise that $33 million backloaded team option. Will be interesting to see what, if anything, he's looking for on the free agent market next year. Wrecked physically, but still competent defensively, and potentially a not bad bat. That's kind of the type of guy, if Meyer had been healthy, he's a guy who could kind of fill the type of role I was envisioning if we look to add an infielder. But it doesn't look like there's any obvious answers out there. Jimmy Atkinson, like the glove, the bat is decent. Issue is he's never been trained to play anywhere but second base. If he was a little more versatile in some of those skills, would consider him. Now, granted, with that arm, he's not a third baseman or a shortstop. Quite honestly, with that turn 2 rating, he's probably not really a second baseman. But he has won 5 Gold Glove awards at this point, so what do I know? They're more interested in his range. Michael Arroyo, the bat is fine, would like a little more power, but that infield range doesn't do much for me. And then C.J. Abrams. If the price on somebody like Abrams was low enough, he wouldn't be a horrible guy to have in the mix coming off the bench. Might as well look at Chris Dillard while we're talking. Really like the glove. He hits 283, or he's hitting 283 this year, but that's seems like that's the best season he's potentially ever had in the majors. Looks like he hit 302 and 286 and 290 in previous seasons. So he's a 269 career hitter, not a ton of power. But if the price on him was cheap enough, kind of what we're looking for. Again, I would feel better about it if he already knew how to play second base and third base more competently. But he could be a perhaps somewhat more productive major league bat for us this year than we have right now coming off of the bench with the youngster Mercado. So definitely a lot for us to think about, I guess. And again, we don't just have to try to get players who are on the trade block. We can go and try to get anybody we want. A lot of relievers, as there always are, available on the trade market. And not surprisingly, there are no ace starters available. Chris Green looks to be a very competent major league starter, though. I don't think that profile really adds much for us. We've got a lot of guys who are good, solid 3 or 4 type starters, which seems to be what his profile is. But if the price was right, it's something to at least consider. But we don't have any huge needs. That doesn't mean we're not going to try to improve this team, though. And before we finish up, and if you're still watching, thank you so much. I wanted to just circle back to that 2028 draft class that I briefly mentioned a while back. And I think when we did that draft, I felt like, boy, if everything works well, this draft really worked out great for us. And in retrospect, I feel you can't ask for much of a better draft than this, especially because, I guess we were picking near the top, and then with Zap is our 5th overall pick. And Zap at this point is the only player out of those top 5 who is not a major leaguer yet. But he would be if not for that fractured foot, having a really good season in AAA this year. Another guy that if we were to move on from a Grahovac could certainly help us at the major league level this year. So think that he is a really good prospect. And then the other 5 players who we picked in the first 5 rounds of the draft are all major leaguers at this point. Tyreek Hardage, we've talked about, became our starting center fielder this year, having a good, solid season for us. Could be our center fielder for years to come, unless he's replaced in that position by somebody like Zap. Nate Kimmel, we've talked about, making his major league debut this year also, hitting .281 in limited action, simply because our team is so good. It's hard to find him at bats. Sincere Shazier, we've talked about, came out of the 4th round and really over the last 3+ seasons has just blossomed into one of the top young pitchers in baseball. Feel like he was snubbed for the All-Star team this year, but looks well on his way to excellent second season in the majors. And then certainly last but not least, Yohane Varejo, who we talked about, spent some time on the injured list this year with that elbow inflammation that kept him out for about 2 weeks. Also had a finger blister earlier in the year. So he's missed a little time off and on, only 1 IL stint. But he's been good for us this year, too, with a .260 ERA, well over a strikeout per inning. Feel like for a 5th-round pick, we thought that's kind of where we're willing to start shooting shots on relievers. And Varejo looks like he could be a good one for us for many years to come. So we look at that draft, and in the first 5 rounds, we've got a potential important arm in our bullpen, a potential ace starter, a potential starting center fielder, and with Zap and Kimmel, 2 guys who are also in the mix to be a potential starting outfielder / corner infielder. So, again, going 5 for 5 in terms of major leaguers in the first 5 rounds. I don't think you can do much better than that. And most seasons, I certainly don't have that type of hit rate. But that 2028 draft at this point is looking pretty special for the Buffalo Wings and is starting to become a big part with 4 of the 5 players making their major league debuts over the past 15 or 16 months. And as I talked about, the top pick of ours in the draft, Zap, likely to make his major league debut in the coming months. a big part of the reason why this team is 64-24 at the 2034 All-Star break. And we will find out what, if anything, we end up doing as we approach the trade deadline in our next episode. Until then, thanks so much for watching, and hope you have a great day.